usual thing. Using the magic system is sex-based. It's more a priesthood, and the male and the female variants of that are at war with each other. So I've got the protagonist is a woman, and her helper is a man, and they have a mission that they have to work together, and that's got the built-in conflict that goes along with that, because they have
the sexes
way out there. Yes. So it's been a lot of fun to write that, but I don't do outlining, so it's all been figuring it out as I go.
Well, I think some people are having actually more logical thought process, and you would think someone who was a lawyer would, but now I really, when it comes to just story plotting ideas, I really have to think it through, at least to the point where I have that, like a 10-page, I had for Blood Songs, I had like a 10-page outline of or not, like say, plot arc and character arc, and I knew kind of what I wanted to do. But I mean, there was lots of things that came up in the middle of it that surprised me. But I was able to ask that question, okay, is this actually going to do something here? Is this going to move the plot along? Is it going to change the character in the direction that I wanted to go? And, as long as the answer was yes, that was fine. And there was one point where I had to come up with a plot change because I'm like, that I had the hero was trying to catch up with the heroine, and he did. And it's like, this is the wrong part of the plot for that.
and so tying into the very first question that we had, I've had several instances where characters have been created whole cloth, and the environment is created whole cloth, because my character's here, because I'm used to writing short stories, whole different beast from novels. And my character's here. I eventually want to get him here. I know what's going on at the beginning, but how do I get over there? And I wind up creating new situations. Luckily, one of the things in pulp style writing is that the character bounces around a lot, chasing false leads. The trick is to not make the false leads frustrating for the audience. You want the false leads to be entertaining, but you're still world building at that point. And also remember something: if you're writing a novel, if you decide, oh wait, I really should have introduced that bar earlier, remember not to repeat the same text in both places. When you copy and paste it over to earlier in the book, delete the text later, or delete the text later in the book, or you're going to wind up, an editor's going to go, wait a minute.
The advice I've heard on that is, if you decide you need to make a change earlier in the book, make a note to yourself, keep writing, and add it during the revision process, so you don't inadvertently hose yourself over by double including.
Yes.
I'd like to take a moment to see if our audience has any questions, comments, things to toss our way.
Keeping your style in a particular format through the whole novel, is that hard? Because I
don't
have
think
that.
so. Then again, I write mostly contemporary, so I just look at the real world.
I mean, word presentation.
Oh, you mean voice or something like that?
Like, you have a particular style in mind about how all the wording is, and just keeping with that.
The best advice I have on that is your voice. You may not think you write with a particular voice because you're writing with the same words that you think inside your head. When you try to put an outside style of speaking and writing on yourself, I think you might be doing yourself a disservice. Write what comes naturally to you and what flows, and it'll always be consistent. Now, of course, my panelists will probably disagree with me. There we go.
There is, again, exception to the rule, because everything's different. But if your actors are able to switch back and forth between things, so you get some writers that are able to write completely different styles. I do, and my problem is that sometimes I want to do those styles together. I do comedy and I do serious. Right now, the only thing that's been published of mine is serious, but I'm basically a little bit more serious than Terry Pratchett. Unfortunately, in my opinion, not as deep as Terry Pratchett, but that's where I'm comfortable with, is slightly more serious than Terry Pratchett, and maintaining that without getting too serious or too or too funny, too wacky, because I want to do the wacky in a different story, a different novel that I've got an idea for. Be more like Christopher Moore in that case. Scott Lynch with Liza Locke-Lamora actually used pretty much, well, he used 3 voices because his dialogue often sounds like it's coming straight out of a Quentin Tarantino movie. And his normal writing style for it flows one way, whereas when he waxes lyrical about the environment and the actual world building that he does, it sort of grounds the story a little bit and actually emphasizes and makes the more fun stuff more fun than it would be without that grounding. So.
I think if you're like writing, for example, traditional fantasy, obviously you don't want to use a lot of modern slang or lingo or anything. In fact, when I write the narrative part of a traditional fantasy, the only contractions I use are N''T. I think if you don't do that much, most people it's going to read really stilted.
Yeah.
I mean, the people who try to write like Tolkien, he was a linguist. I am not a linguist. I can't carry that off. But I've had editors tell me that was really natural. They really liked the way I wrote the narrative for fantasy. So that's for traditional fantasy, that I didn't try to be too high, that it didn't sound modern. I think you're going to have several voices. Your narrative, if it's third person, depends on. It's just most of the time it's third person, but it's still essentially one person's viewpoint. It'll be colored by the way they think and speak, and so if you switch viewpoints, when you get to another viewpoint, it should sound different, because it should be the way that person sees things and thinks about things and their vocabulary. If you have a prince and you have a slave, they're not going to have the same vocabulary. And so when you're in the slave's head, and they're certainly not going to look at the world the same way. So when you're in the slave's head, it's going to be a very different picture. In fact, that's always my favorite thing about multiple viewpoint stories, is that you can have 2 characters look at the exact same thing and see 2 completely different things. See it just 2 different ways. And I just love that, because that's so real. 2 people will look at the same thing and have very different opinions. Just look at politics. People can't agree on that at all.
And the best example of different voices that I've ever seen is, again, talking about Christopher Moore. He's got a trilogy right now, with a side note off into A Dirty Job, but he's got a trilogy based around some vampires that he created as a second book that he ever wrote. And he keeps coming back to it over things, but the most recent one is called You Suck, a love story. One of the characters, he switches viewpoints in the different chapters, and one of the characters almost makes you put the book down until you get used to how she's talking. And then her chapters are some of the best. Once you get used to Abby Normal's style of talking when she's narrating, because she's blogging it as a teenager, as a goth teenager. She's blogging the thing, and you're like, oh God, just get to the next chapter, please. By the end of the book, hers are the best ones, because you've gotten used to her style. But and hers are hilarious. But
Did we come close to even answering your question?
Yes.
it's
Awesome. Any other questions? Okay. You write comedy as well as serious. How do you world build for comedy?
It'll depend on the type of comedy. For instance, if it's the wacky, that's not unlike that's not unlike the Chris Moore stuff that I was talking about. Then you can go off into interesting tropes and play with them. For instance, mad scientists. you can go. I mean, you can have a character named Igor and get away with it, especially if you make that character interesting. But if you're doing like